the Making an Impact podcast series by Schroders, sharing ESG insights from our sustainable and investment professionals. In this episode, Mervyn Tang, Head of Sustainability Strategy APAC, talks to Catherine McCauley, Sustainable Investment Analyst, about natural capital. One of the key roles investors can play is influencing the practices of companies who impact the natural world. Over 50% of global GDP is dependent on nature, so Schroders is making nature and biodiversity central to our active engagement. During this episode, both TCFD and TNFD are referred to. These are frameworks that companies can use to publicly disclose and report the climate-related and nature-related financial risks and opportunities on their businesses.
Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of Making the Impact podcast. We're here today with Catherine McCauley, who's on our sustainable investment research team and is our specialist on biodiversity and natural capital. Welcome, Catherine. Now, just briefly, I guess for the viewers, what is natural capital and why is it so important for investment decisions?
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Mervyn. So people often hear natural capital and think, what on earth does that mean? Not to start this off with a pun, but it's really just a way of talking about nature and nature's assets. So we're thinking about everything from soil to rocks, coral reefs to forests. And these assets provide what are termed ecosystem services that are pretty fundamental to most businesses and economic activity. So the World Economic Forum estimates that up to 50% of global GDP is somewhat heavily reliant on nature. So, things like crop pollination or carbon sequestration, climate regulation and flood protection, which makes sense. It's kind of hard to think of an activity or a sector that doesn't interact with nature in some way. Companies are embedded in nature and in many instances they rely on it for their continued operation to produce their products, etc. So it's important for many of the same reasons that climate change is important in investment decisions. Companies are facing physical risks that could disrupt operations, as well as transitional risks as regulation develops and consumers and investors start to price this in and factor it into purchasing and investment decisions. I think it's really clear that the value drivers of the global economy are starting to shift and investors need to stay ahead of the curve.
That's great. It does not sound easy to put a value on this natural capital assets. How do you do that? And how do you identify the biggest challenges and opportunities?
So ecosystem valuation is an industry that's existed for decades. It's typically used by insurers and governments. So if you think about something like an oil spill, there will be technical experts that are sent in to try to quantify the contamination impacts. And they'll often use things like replacement or restoration costs. I think one of the key challenges when you think about public markets is the absence of being able to perform that type of detailed analysis at the local level, and often the capacity for our portfolio companies to do that is nascent or frankly non-existent. So we really need to find proxies to try to assess company exposure to nature-related risks and opportunities and really understand how companies are managing this. Naturally, that also presents an opportunity. So that's something we've been doing a lot of work on, is developing frameworks to understand these exposures and opportunities at a sector and an industry level. And data here is really improving all the time. So, where you have asset-specific location data, for example, you can do some really fascinating analysis.
I do seem to hear natural capital mentioned all the time in the media, in conferences, in research reports. Where do you see this kind of evolving in the coming years, and kind of what does this mean for investors out there?
Yeah, we saw this at COP26 last year. There was a huge emphasis on nature and in particular on land use and on deforestation. So we saw commitments coming from governments, from corporates, from financial institutions, including ourselves. I think the journey on climate is a really interesting analogy here. So, we saw TCFD guidance come out in 2017, and about 5 years later, it's becoming mandatory. So, we're set to see the nature equivalent to TCFD released formally next year. It's sort of in its draft phase now. But to be clear, I think the journey on nature needs to be a lot quicker than it has been on climate. And I do think we're also in a position to move more quickly because a lot of the groundwork has been laid. I think we can expect a huge focus on disclosure, and investors should really be engaging with these frameworks with their portfolio companies to improve their visibility on nature-related issues. And I think, focusing on those industries and sectors that have the greatest impact and dependence on nature, and signaling to companies in those industries, that we really need to see ambition and disclosure and ultimately progress on natural capital and biodiversity. Mervyn, turning the tables back on you. We've been getting a lot more incoming client requests on natural capital, everything's from, reporting to solutions. It would be great to hear your perspective on what's driving this.
Of course. I guess it's never been investors not thinking biodiversity is important. I think they always did. It was always just seemed intangible compared to climate. But I think in the developments, like you mentioned with TNFD, I think advances in data science, better disclosure by companies, it's starting to become more tangible. So I think you're seeing products and solutions out in the market. The numbers that are coming out for investors and our clients is becoming more meaningful. And so I think this kind of data revolution, this evolution is driving interest amongst our clients because now it's become much more actionable. And I think the second thing, and for many of our clients, the commercials are really important. And so one of the things driving investment, or thinking about direct investment in natural capital, is the carbon offset market and the capacity for a lot of natural capital assets to be able to sequester carbon and hence generate offsets.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear that more clients are thinking about natural capital as an asset class and how it relates to climate change and carbon. What are the kinds of things that they're considering when directly investing in natural capital?
There's the return component where you have to understand how carbon markets will evolve in the future and what that means for the cash flow of these natural capital assets. But I think another factor that's kind of increasingly relevant is that a lot of these forestry natural capital assets actually have biodiversity co-benefits, right? They may be homes for a lot of natural habitats. They may be even act as floodplains in terms of mitigating physical risks. And so you have to think not just about that carbon offset cash flow potential, but what the potential value is of these kind of biodiversity and other environmental factors. And so I think one of the interesting developments coming out from the Singapore Climate Impact X, which will be effectively an exchange for a lot of these natural capital projects, is they'll be giving descriptions of projects, not just for their carbon offset potential, but also their biodiversity benefits. And with the development of these exchanges, we will see more of a pricing come through on how much these biodiversity benefits will be valued in the market. Wow, so time has really run by quickly, and unfortunately we have to end this podcast, but it's been great having you on this conversation, Catherine, and I hope all the viewers enjoyed this.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Mervyn.
This is prepared by Schroders for information and general circulation only, and the opinions expressed are subject to change without notice. It does not constitute an offer or solicitation to deal in units of any Schroders funds and does not regard to the specific investment objectives, financial situation, or the particular needs of any specific person who may receive this.